In April 2007, the Government of Canada commissioned an independent review of the federal penitentiary system. The review panel examined a number of issues related to the federal prison population, the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, safety and security within federal penitentiaries, institutional programming and community release, the state of physical infrastructure, and other issues regarding CSC's operations. Report recommendations included refocusing the CCRA to place public safety as the primary objective of the federal penitentiary system. Apparently that's not what they were doing before. To replace statutory release with earned parole, because parole is currently not earned as well apparently. To increase drug interdiction efforts within institutional walls, and to consider building large-scale, multi-level regional complexes to replace aging penal infrastructure. Following the release of the report, CSC quickly assembled a transformation team in 2008, tasked with implementing the recommendations made by the review panel over a 2-year period. Modernizing physical infrastructure is currently listed on the CSC Transformation Agenda webpage as one of the major initiatives being pursued by the organization. There used to be a webpage that actually listed that they were planning regional complexes, but that disappeared from CSC's website last summer. However, during the period I conducted my research, no specific plans regarding the major construction initiatives being pursued by CSC as part of their perpetuation agenda, or how they plan to cope with the cumulative influx of new prisoners resulting from all federal sentencing measures were released to the public. In fact, the organization and its commissioner cited cabinet confidence as a means to legitimate secrecy, while Public Safety Minister Vic Taves stated, "I'd rather not share my idea on that. It will come out in due course," of course when the shovels are in the ground. As noted in my introduction, these plans and related costs are slowly becoming visible to Canadians. In large part because of the pressure the federal government faced before and after the release of the Parliamentary Budget Officer report on the costs of implementing Bill C-25. However, much remains unknown. So, what I've tried to do so far is to paint a picture of some of the justifications that have been marshaled to expand prison systems across the country. While ongoing initiatives at the provincial territorial level appear to be guided by a desire to replace aging infrastructure with space that is better suited to meet changing programming objectives, manage persistent overcrowding driven by rising remand populations, and coping with the number of prisoners suffering from drug addiction and mental illness. In most cases, the plans did not take into account future population growth resulting from federal sentencing reforms. And in fact, when I looked at the documents, PEI and New Brunswick are the only ones that actually factored in what was taking place in terms of federal legislation as they put forward their plans to build new penitentiaries, which means they actually don't have room, even when these facilities come online, to absorb what's going to be taking place in the coming years. So, based on what is known about the failure of imprisonment as an approach to enhancing safety in our communities, we must ask ourselves whether we've missed an opportunity after opportunity to implement more meaningful solutions to the complex conflicts and harms in our communities that we call crime. If the past is any indication, in a few years various jurisdictions will again be chasing after the perpetual dream of penal reform, the dream that keeps on giving us more and more prisons. The next wave of prison expansion in Canada that is underway, however, as illustrated by recent announcements regarding the expansion of CSC institutions, they'll most likely be a result of the federal government's punishment agenda. In response to this push to incarcerate, I have two critiques related to the substance of the minority conservative government of Canada's so-called tough on crime platform, so critiquing what they're doing, and the process through which these initiatives are being enacted, so how they're doing it. So, what the government's currently doing is looking to put more people in prisons for longer periods of time with fewer chances of release. And this approach has been critiqued by academics, advocacy groups, penal system practitioners, and policymakers, although perhaps more behind closed doors than out in the open, journalists, and some parliamentarians for a number of reasons. And here's my top 10. The top 10. Okay. So the push to incarcerate is occurring when the overall volume of police-reported crime has declined steadily since 1991. The push to incarcerate is occurring when the overall severity of police-reported crime has declined since 1999. And if you don't believe these figures, you'll note in the victimization surveys that levels of victimization have remained relatively stable across this period of time. In other jurisdictions where the use of imprisonment increased, there was a negligible impact on their crime rates. So whether or not their prison populations went down or if they went up, the crime rate remained relatively the same. Many legislative proposals have passed would further exacerbate the capacity crisis we have in our prisons, which not only places the safety of prisoners and staff at risk, as noted by CSC Deputy Commissioner Deputy Commissioner Malkaut-Balit, but also puts the public at greater risk as more prisoners may not have access to the programs and resources they may need to safely reintegrate into society. And we know that the Correctional Investigator of Canada has said there's long waiting lists, lack of professionals employed in federal penitentiaries. So we have this situation. Now we're going to be throwing thousands of more prisoners into this situation. It's only going to create longer waiting lines and less ability for prisoners to reintegrate into society. Many legislative proposals have passed would result in the further marginalization of Canadian society's most vulnerable, the poor, those addicted to drugs, and those with severe mental health issues, most of whom should arguably not be in prison in the first place. As I went through provincial and territorial government reports and you see, well, we have a changing prisoner population. Okay, let's accept that. Okay, so we have this, and a lot of it's composed of people who are addicted to drugs, women, and people who have mental health issues. What are these people doing in prison in the first place? We're criminalizing addiction. We're criminalizing mental illness. That's what's going on here. So, okay. You're welcome. Many legislative proposals have passed would only exacerbate the overrepresentation of Aboriginals in prisons, the new residential schools. This focus on crime has shifted the focus away from the actions and inactions of our governments and corporations that place us at far greater risk of death or injury than most menaces we face in our streets. This focus on crime divides rather than builds communities by inculcating fear into its members in a way that alienates us from our neighbors. This focus on crime divides rather than builds communities by framing public safety as an issue of being tough or soft, and leaves us with a one-size-all carceral solution to the complex conflicts and harms in our communities that we call crime. This approach ignores the fact that building more prisons to address crime is like building more graveyards to address a fatal disease, and that the vast majority of human needs that result from crime cannot be met by using the cold hand of retribution. The increase in our reliance on prisons will leave the newest generation of Canadian workers with prison mortgages to pay until they retire, when their tax dollars should have been bankrolling more robust health care and retirement programs for their parents and grandparents, as well as social services such as affordable housing, education, and employment that contribute to community safety by enhancing our collective well-being. Beyond what the federal government is attempting to do, I also take issue with their expectation that every time they say tough on crime, protecting victims, public safety, or any other cloth they try to wrap around their punishment agenda, that Canadians are expected to automatically believe their rhetoric and cut a blank check as if it should be a reflex to their tagline justice campaign. Ignore the facts. Don't ask questions. Don't critique. Don't propose alternatives. After all, these are symptoms of a pathology known as being soft on crime, we're told. Stop being a pussy and get tough on crime already. The fact that Commissioner Head cited cabinet confidence during his appearances before MPs and senators regarding CSE population and related cost projections related to new pieces of legislation, and that Minister Taves has publicly stated that he'd rather not share his idea on how much the Conservative punishment agenda will cost taxpayers, is an affront to democracy and should have no place in Canada. Canadians have a right to know, and we're being denied that right, plain and simple, and we deserve better. Okay, so in closing, I'd like to note that there are currently a number of pieces of legislation before Parliament that, if passed, will increase how many people we incarcerate in our provincial, territorial, and federal prisons. If these laws are passed under a cloak of secrecy, we will further entrench the democratic deficit in our country by acquiescing to our political representatives and continuing to allow them to fall well short of the principle of transparency that is integral to governance in this country. In the process, we'll also devastate our communities, depriving them of the resources needed to prevent victimization where possible and address conflicts in meaningful ways when they occur, because we diverted a significant portion of our resources to fund the monuments of societal failure that we call prisons. But this is not simply about the communities and democracy we don't want. This is about the communities and democracies we want to build. In the months ahead, in your capacity as professionals and citizens, I urge you to contact parliamentarians of all political stripes to demand truth, to demand transparent democracy, and to demand community capacity to address crime. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because your jobs as community service providers will be on the line as mechanisms such as accelerated parole review, day parole, full parole, and statutory release may soon be abolished or retrenched as the tough on crime agenda marches on. Thanks for your time.